Hey guys, it's Mr. Freeman here again. So for today's video, we will be going over Unit 2, questions 15 through 17. And then also, if you have not watched Miss Rowe's read aloud videos of the Wild Horses of Assateague Island and Wild Ponies of Chincoteague, pause the video here, head over to Miss Rowe's channel, watch those two read alouds, and then come back before you go over this section, okay? Awesome. All right, so let's take a look at question number 15 first. All right, number 15, part A says, which statement best explains why the ponies travel from Assateague Island to Chincoteague Island? So let's look at the answer choices here. Answer choice A says, on Chincoteague Island, there is more food for large numbers of ponies to eat. Letter B says, on Assateague Island, the poor weather is harmful to the ponies. Answer choice C says, on Chincoteague Island, there is better grass for the ponies to graze. And letter D says, on Assateague Island, there is limited space for large numbers of ponies to live. Now, I know what you're thinking. Let's go ahead and eliminate two answer choices that we know are incorrect for sure. I'll give you a moment to look at your answer choices again. Take a moment to think. All right, so the ones I've decided to get rid of are letter choices B and C. The text, Assateague Island, does not mention anything about the poor weather being harmful to the ponies, and that being the reason why they travel from Assateague to Chincoteague. That is not mentioned in the text. I'm also going to get rid of letter choice C, that mentions there being better grass there for them to graze. That also was not mentioned in the text. So that leaves us with two answer choices, letter A and letter D. Out of these two choices, the one that makes the most sense, and I can actually go back and find evidence for, would be letter choice D. You are correct. On Assateague Island, there is limited space for large numbers of ponies to live, which brings us to 15, part B. We always have to find the evidence to support or prove our answer. So which one of these answer choices proves what we chose for part A? Part A, we said on Assateague Island, there is limited space for large numbers of ponies to live. So let's look at these four answer choices and see which one best supports letter D. So letter A on part B says, to keep the herd from getting too big, some new foals are sold each year at auction. Letter B says, the saltwater cowboys were rounding them up. Letter C says, some slept and some of the foals suckled their mother's milk. And letter D says they were getting their strength back for the next event. So which one of these answer choices from Wild Ponies of Chincoteague best supports letter D from part A, which said on Assateague Island, there is limited space for large numbers of ponies to live? So which one of these best supports that answer choice? Let's take a moment to think. I want to think about which one supports there being limited space for these ponies. If you said letter A, you are correct. Letter A says, to keep the herd from getting too big, some new foals are sold each year at auction. So that phrase, getting too big, also is associated or connected to there being limited space. So when they grow, they need more space, okay? Awesome. All right, let's move down to number 16, part A. Number 16, part A says, how does the author mainly organize the information in Wild Ponies of Chincoteague? Now, this has to do with kind of what we talked about right before we got out of school, guys. We were talking about how authors oftentimes will organize informational text in different ways, and that's just to help you, the reader, understand what you're reading, okay? Just a little bit easier. So let's look at these answer choices, and we're gonna look back in the text as well to see how the author mainly organized the information that was in Wild Ponies of Chincoteague. Letter A says, by stating a problem and how it can be solved. Letter B says, by stating a point of view and then comparing ideas. Letter C says, by explaining the causes and effects of an event. And letter D says, by explaining events in the order that they happened. So let's scroll back up to Wild Ponies of Chincoteague. Now, one thing that you want to take a closer look at are the headings here that is above each section of this passage. The first one says, Wednesday morning, really early. The next heading says, going to town. The next heading says, day of the auction. The next heading says, going home. So let's think about those headings, because those headings are a part of how the author has organized this passage. But why would the author include those specific headings in this passage to organize information? Do those headings state a problem and how it can be solved? Do they state a point of view and then compare ideas? Do they explain causes and effects of an event? Or do they explain the events in the order that they happened? Let's take a second to think about which answer choices we can go ahead and get rid of. All right, the ones I'm going to get rid of are letters B and C. The author does not at any point state a point of view and compare them to other ideas. The author also does not show causes and effects of a specific event. So I can get rid of those. Now, the author does state a problem, but it does not give several ideas of how that problem can be solved. What the author does do is, letter D, explain the events in the order that they happened. The author is walking us through the event of when people go and watch the ponies as they travel through the channel, and just kind of explaining to us the order of events that happens, or when that happens. All right, so part B, let's see which sentence from the article supports the structure in the answer to part A. So remember, in part A, we said that the author organized the events, or the information, excuse me, in this passage by explaining the events in the order that they happened. So we want to think about which detail from part B supports or proves that. Letter A, the weather was wet and dreary, and I felt like an icicle as raindrops fell cold against my cheeks. Let's think, does that explain the events in the order that they happened? Letter B, first I heard faint whinnying sounds drifting through the salty air. Let's think for a second, does that prove that events were explained in the order that they happened? Letter C, my sisters and I sloshed through the mud to get to the corral where the ponies were held for the auction. Or letter D, the pony was strong and spirited and I had to hold him back. Now, I know someone has already shouted the answer out because of a specific transition word that they see here. And we know that transition words give the order, sometimes they can give the order of something. They can kind of be clue words to tell you what happened in what order. So the only transition word we see here out of these four answer choices is the transition word first, which is a part of letter B. So letter B is the best answer choice here. First, I heard faint whinnying sounds drifting through the salty air. that proves that the author organized the information in this text by explaining events in the order that they happened. All right. And last but not least, number 17. So for number 17, the directions say that we have to refer to both passages, the Wild Horses of Assateague Island and the article Wild Ponies of Chincoteague, before we answer question number 17. Part A to number 17 says, which statement best describes a difference between the information in the Wild Horses of Assateague Island and the information in Wild Ponies of Chincoteague? So they want us to describe what's the difference between these two. One's a passage and one is the article. So let's think about what's the main difference between these two passages. Letter A says, the Wild Horses of Assateague Island tells more about the work people do with horses. B, the Wild Horses of Assateague Island tells more about what it is like to visit the horses. Letter C says, Wild Ponies of Chincoteague includes more information about how the horses first came to the island. And letter D says, Wild Ponies of Chincoteague includes more information about how people feel about the horses. So let's take a moment to think about which answer choices we can go ahead and get rid of. If you put on your thinking hat, think, what's the difference between these two passages? All right, the ones that I've decided to get rid of are letters A and B. Letter A says the Wild Horses of Assateague Island tells more about the work people do with horses. Although this article does include information about how people care for the horses, like when they receive veterinary care, there's another example. This passage does not necessarily tell more about the work that people do with horses than the other text. So let's look at letter B. The Wild Horses of Assateague Island tells more about what it is like to visit the horses. That is also untrue. It does not give us more information about what it is like to visit the horses. So that leaves us with letter C and D. Now, letter C says that the Wild Ponies of Chincoteague includes more information about how the horses first came to the island. And although this text does talk about people, or excuse me, not people, it talks about how the horses first came to the island, both texts also include that information. So this one does not necessarily include more information. So that leaves us with letter choice D. The Wild Ponies of Chincoteague includes more information about how people feel about the horses. We do, there are several points of evidence where we actually have the author explaining or expressing how it felt when he or she saw the horses, okay? So part B, which sentence best supports the answer to part A? So which one of these answer choices proves that that passage does include more information about how people feel about the horses? Here we go, letter choice A. During the 17th century, free roaming horses, cows, sheep, and pigs caused expensive crop damage to local farms. Does that tell us how people feel about the horses? Let's keep moving. Letter choice B, Virginia's horses are privately owned by the Chincoteague Volunteer Fire Department and receive some veterinary care. Does that explain how people feel about the horses? Letter C, I loved the ponies at first sight. Does that explain how people feel about the horses? Or letter choice D, the cowboys were herding them right down Main Street. All right, so let's think for a second. Which one of these sentences from the two texts best supports and shows how people feel about the horses? All right, I know someone shouted it out. It is letter choice, C. Letter choice C says, I loved the ponies at first sight. So here, this sentence clearly shows how a person feels about the horses or the ponies, okay? So that is all for today. Tune back in tomorrow when we move on to questions 18 and 19, okay? And like I said before, make sure you guys head over to Miss Rowe's channel so that you can get a chance to listen to her do a read aloud of these two texts before you answer questions 15 through 17, as well as 18 through 19 for the next day. All right. And I will see you guys tomorrow.